Captain Alina Ward had never liked small talk. She preferred precision, clarity, and observing her surroundings before drawing attention. As she stepped off the transport at Fort Ridge, the crisp autumn wind tugged at the cuffs of her uniform, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and engine oil, a combination that immediately told her more than any briefing could. This base, she noted, was functional but rigid, steeped in tradition, and likely resistant to change. It was precisely the kind of environment that demanded patience, strategy, and an unshakable presence. The rumor of a Pentagon inspection had traveled ahead of her arrival, and she could feel the undercurrent of tension even as she walked past rows of neatly lined-up vehicles and soldiers standing at attention. Conversations halted briefly when her sharp, focused gaze swept across the grounds. The whispers began immediately, not malicious, but curious. Alina was new, and yet something about her demeanor suggested she carried far more authority than a typical captain. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to hierarchy and predictability noticed it, though most dared not acknowledge it. Her calm stride carried her toward the main office, where Colonel Bryce Dalton, a man whose ego was as large as his decorated chest, awaited the arrival of the new officer. Dalton was infamous across Fort Ridge for his tendency to belittle anyone he considered inexperienced. He had spent years cementing his reputation, often using fear and mockery as tools to maintain control. Today, he had a new target, and from the moment he spotted Alina, he intended to remind everyone why he considered himself untouchable. Dalton's first words were sharp and dripping with condescension. Well, looks like they've sent us someone fresh out of wherever they pull captains from these days." He chuckled, slapping the desk with exaggerated bravado. "You're here to observe, I assume, or just to fumble through paperwork." Alina did not flinch. She maintained eye contact, her posture erect, shoulders squared. "I'm here to support the mission and ensure smooth operations," she said clearly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. There was no arrogance, no need to assert dominance. Her presence alone made Dalton uneasy, though he refused to admit it. The room felt heavy, charged with Dalton's unspoken challenge and Alina's quiet confidence. She had learned long ago that people like Dalton thrived on the discomfort they created in others. The trick, she knew, was to let them reveal themselves while she remained steady, observing, recording, and waiting for the right moment to act. Dalton, oblivious to the silent evaluation, continued, "I hope you're capable of keeping up, Captain. This base isn't for amateurs or anyone who needs hand-holding. I run a tight ship here." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, a smug grin plastered across his face. "I assume you understand what that means." Alina's lips curved into a polite, non-committal smile. "Understood, sir," she replied. Her tone was neutral, yet firm, a subtle assertion that she belonged here, though she made no effort to provoke him. Dalton misinterpreted her restraint as hesitation, his grin widening with self-assured superiority. The staff watched in silence. Some were curious, others anxious, and a few were already sympathetic to the newcomer. They had witnessed Dalton's behavior countless times, his need to dominate and mock anyone who threatened his ego. Alina's composure, however, unsettled him. It was a quiet power he had rarely encountered. As the briefing continued, Dalton began assigning what he considered trivial tasks, thinking he was subtly undermining Alina. She was asked to organize files, review minor logistical reports, and handle administrative details that, in Dalton's mind, were beneath a seasoned officer. Alina performed each task meticulously, paying attention to details that Dalton had overlooked for years. Every form she corrected, every minor inefficiency she noted, only added to the invisible record she was building, a record Dalton would regret ignoring. Outside, the base hummed with activity. Soldiers trained in the yard, mechanics repaired vehicles, and administrative staff scurried through the corridors. Alina observed all of it with a strategic eye. She noted the discipline, the morale, the small inefficiencies that no one else seemed to notice. Dalton assumed she was simply following orders, but in reality, she was mapping the entire command structure, cataloging weaknesses, and identifying areas for improvement. Despite Dalton's mocking tone, Alina maintained a calm demeanor. She never retaliated verbally, never allowed frustration to show. Her patience was deliberate, her silence calculated. Each time Dalton belittled her, she made a note, internalized it, and waited. It was a game she had played many times before in her career, and she always knew the right moment to reveal her hand. By the end of the first day, it became apparent to the few perceptive officers and enlisted personnel that Alina was not what Dalton assumed. Her efficiency, attention to detail, and calm authority set her apart from every other officer on the base. Whispers began to circulate. She's not just a captain, there's something different about her. Dalton, of course, laughed off these rumors, seeing them as envy or nonsense. Alina's mind, however, was focused. She had arrived at Fort Ridge with a clear mission, and she intended to see it through without unnecessary drama. Dalton's arrogance provided her the perfect cover. No one suspected that the captain he mocked so freely could outmaneuver him at every turn. As she walked back to her quarters that evening, she reviewed the day in her head, every interaction, every oversight, every misstep by Dalton, knowing that this was only the beginning. Fort Ridge, Alina realized, would soon learn an important lesson. Rank alone does not define authority, and appearances can be deceiving. And Colonel Dalton, arrogant and unprepared, had no idea that the most influential presence on his base had just arrived, quiet, composed, and miles above him in rank and expertise. The evening sky deepened to a rich shade of navy as she stood on her balcony, gazing across the base. The lights of the buildings flickered like stars on the ground. Alina allowed herself a brief smile. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, and she would let Dalton's own overconfidence be his undoing. The next morning at Fort Ridge, the base buzzed with its usual routine. Soldiers marched in formation, vehicles rumbled across gravel roads, and the faint metallic tang of the armory hung in the air. Alina Ward entered the staff briefing room, calm and composed as ever. She carried a slim folder under her arm, filled with notes she had meticulously compiled the night before. Colonel Bryce Dalton, however, had already staked his claim to the room. He lounged behind his desk, a smug grin plastered across his face, ready to assert dominance over anyone who dared to challenge him. His eyes flicked to Alina, and he immediately leaned forward, tapping the desk with an impatient finger. "Well, Captain Ward," he said, voice dripping with mockery, "I trust you've come prepared to keep up with the adults, or will you be struggling with basic procedures today?" Alina's lips curved into a polite smile, neutral, controlled. She did not respond immediately. Dalton misread the silence, convinced he had unsettled her. "Answer me, Captain," he barked, clearly enjoying the control he thought he had. "I am ready to contribute to the mission, Colonel," Alina replied evenly. Her calm tone carried weight, not authority to shout down, but authority that could not be ignored. Dalton, of course, ignored it. He was certain that words alone established hierarchy, not competence. Dalton began to issue tasks he believed would embarrass her in front of the entire staff. He handed her reports that were poorly organized, marked with mistakes and riddled with omissions. "Here," he said smugly, "try to make sense of this. I wouldn't want you to feel left out." His laughter echoed across the room. Alina took the documents without a word. She examined them quietly, her mind working rapidly. Where Dalton saw trivial tasks and a chance to humiliate, she saw opportunities to demonstrate efficiency and precision. With meticulous attention, she corrected errors, reorganized logistics, and identified procedural inconsistencies that Dalton had overlooked for years. Other officers in the room watched, exchanging glances. Some were impressed but too intimidated by Dalton to speak. Others whispered quietly among themselves. "She's really thorough," one lieutenant murmured. "I've never seen anyone work like that under his gaze." Dalton, however, was blissfully unaware. He saw only the facade, a young captain quietly completing tasks he considered beneath her. His smug grin never faltered, and he even increased the intensity of his ridicule, oblivious to the fact that each humiliation he tried to inflict was simply strengthening her position. During a strategic planning session, Dalton interrupted Alina repeatedly. He mocked her suggestions, dismissing them as naive or irrelevant. "We don't need a child lecturing us on military strategy," he sneered. "Stick to what you can handle, Captain. Leave the real decisions to those who know what they're doing." Alina did not rise to the bait. She allowed him to speak, noting the tone, the phrasing, and the subtle biases in his reasoning. She documented every instance, understanding that this record would be crucial later. Dalton's arrogance, it turned out, provided her with the perfect camouflage. No one suspected that the woman he mocked so freely could outmaneuver him at every turn. By mid-morning, Dalton's theatrics had begun to stir subtle unrest among the junior officers. Many had endured similar treatment in silence, but Alina's presence sparked quiet comparisons. They saw her efficiency, her calm intelligence, and her unwavering confidence. Dalton noticed the glances, the whispered conversations, and yet he interpreted them only as envy, a misunderstanding of his brilliance. Alina moved through the room with calculated grace. She did not confront Dalton directly. Instead, she allowed her actions to speak for her. Each completed task, each corrected report, each subtle insight demonstrated a capability far beyond what Dalton imagined. Where he had sought to humiliate, she had turned it into an opportunity to showcase her competence. During lunch, Dalton cornered Alina in the mess hall. "I don't understand why they sent you here," he said, voice low but sharp. "I've seen captains before, but you act like you belong. Do you really think you can run this place? You're in over your head." Alina's response was measured, deliberate. "I am here to ensure the mission is successful, Colonel. I believe efficiency and proper procedure benefit everyone, including leadership." Her tone was calm, her words polite, yet they carried an undeniable weight. Dalton's face flushed with irritation. Her subtle assertion of authority without aggression only inflamed his ego further. The soldiers around them watched quietly. Some admired her restraint, some felt relief that someone seemed capable of holding her own. Dalton, unaware of how his behavior appeared, dismissed their reactions as meaningless. Afternoon brought another staff meeting, this time with more personnel involved. Dalton attempted to undermine Alina further, assigning her what he thought were impossible tasks: organizing a logistics simulation, reconciling supply discrepancies, and preparing a briefing for the senior Pentagon inspectors scheduled to arrive in a few days. He expected frustration, confusion, maybe even public embarrassment. Instead, Alina tackled every task methodically. She consulted manuals, cross-referenced supply records, and organized personnel efficiently. She even suggested minor improvements in processes, phrased subtly enough to avoid appearing critical of Dalton. The results were impeccable: reports organized, logistics streamlined, and her colleagues quietly impressed. Dalton's mockery only intensified. "Well, I see you've managed not to fail spectacularly," he sneered, though his voice carried a note of disbelief he did not understand. "Don't get too comfortable, Captain. One mistake and you'll learn the difference between someone who pretends to lead and someone who actually commands." Alina smiled faintly, internalizing every word, nodding every gesture. Dalton's arrogance was predictable, but his reliance on appearances was dangerous for him. She had already started building a mental map of his tendencies, his weaknesses, and his insecurities. Every belittling comment, every public humiliation attempt, only provided more data. By evening, whispers of curiosity had grown louder among the junior officers. "Have you noticed how calm she is?" one soldier said. "She doesn't even seem rattled when Dalton's yelling at her." Another replied, "Yeah, but what rank is she really? There's something unusual about her presence." Dalton, oblivious to the speculation, spent the day relishing what he thought was his dominance. Elena, however, had already cemented her footing. By performing flawlessly under scrutiny, she not only protected herself from ridicule but also subtly earned the respect of those around her. As the day ended, Elena returned to her quarters, quietly reviewing every interaction. She cataloged Dalton's weaknesses, the points where his arrogance clouded judgment, and the subtle tensions among the staff. She knew that her real mission was only beginning. Tomorrow, the stakes would rise, and Dalton's lack of foresight would leave him exposed. Elena gazed out over the base, her thoughts precise and methodical. Fort Ridge, she realized, was a battlefield of egos and strategy. Dalton believed he controlled it completely. Yet in her quiet, observant way, she was already orchestrating the conditions that would demonstrate true authority that relied on skill, intelligence, and patience rather than bluster and mockery. Tonight, the base would sleep unaware that a storm was quietly forming within its ranks. Dalton remained oblivious to the fact that the captain he had mocked repeatedly was preparing to outmaneuver him in ways he could not imagine. And Elena, calm and composed as ever, was ready to let the right moment arrive, the moment when appearances would shatter, and the truth of rank and competence would be revealed in full. By the third day at Fort Ridge, it was clear to everyone, except Colonel Dalton, that Captain Elena Ward was no ordinary officer. Soldiers noticed her precise attention to detail, her calm demeanor under scrutiny, and the effortless way she navigated even the most chaotic situations. It wasn't just competence. It was the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without raising a voice. Those who had grown accustomed to Dalton's overbearing presence began to whisper among themselves. "She's different," a sergeant muttered to his squad during a break. "I've seen captains before, but well, I don't know, there's something about her." "Yeah," another replied, glancing toward Elena as she organized training schedules. "She handles everything so smooth, and she doesn't even seem scared of him." The two soldiers exchanged a look of awe, tempered with curiosity. Meanwhile, Dalton remained blissfully unaware. He continued his daily routine of mocking, belittling, and over-exaggerating his authority. Each insult, each public humiliation he attempted, only served to strengthen Elena's standing in the eyes of the onlookers. He assumed he was in complete control, the embodiment of Fort Ridge's hierarchy, yet he failed to see that the foundation of his authority was cracking. Elena, of course, noticed everything. She observed Dalton's predictable behavior, noting every pause, every misstep, every flaw that could later serve as a point of intervention. She recorded quietly in her mind patterns of arrogance, overconfidence, and insecurity that made him vulnerable. Each day, she became more familiar with the base, more attuned to the rhythms of its personnel, and more certain of the strategy she would employ. Encrypted communications from the Pentagon reminded her why she was there. This wasn't just a routine assignment. It was an evaluation of leadership, management, and morale at Fort Ridge. Her role was to observe, document, and assess, all while remaining undercover to ensure the authenticity of her findings. Dalton, in his arrogance, had no idea that his every bluster and sneer was being recorded, catalogued, and analyzed by the very officer who would eventually determine his fate. In the mess hall that afternoon, Dalton made another attempt to assert dominance. He leaned against the counter where Elena was quietly reviewing supply reports. "Captain Ward," he began, voice dripping with condescension, "do you ever wonder if you're out of your depth here? These operations aren't textbooks, they're real life, full of mistakes and surprises. Do you really think you can handle that?" Elena looked up, her eyes meeting his evenly. "I've handled complex operations before, Colonel. I'll continue to do so here to ensure the mission is successful." Her tone was calm, polite, but firm, the kind of tone that carried an unspoken warning. Dalton's jaw tightened. Her composure, her unwavering focus, unsettled him more than any words could. The junior officers began noticing the pattern. Elena was never flustered. She completed tasks efficiently, corrected mistakes without criticism, and handled Dalton's provocations with quiet confidence. They whispered about her abilities, speculating about her rank and experience. Some even suspected she had connections to high-ranking officials, though none dared to ask directly. Dalton, of course, laughed off these whispers, confident that no one could match his authority. By late afternoon, Alina moved to inspect the training grounds. Soldiers were conducting tactical exercises, and Dalton had insisted on overseeing everything himself. He barked orders, interrupted drills unnecessarily, and criticized minor errors with exaggerated gestures. Alina watched silently, taking note of his management style, the lack of coordination, the confusion among his subordinates, the unnecessary tension he created. When Dalton tried to micromanage a tactical simulation, Alina stepped in subtly, offering suggestions framed as questions rather than directives. "Have we considered adjusting the perimeter here to account for the terrain?" she asked softly. "It might reduce exposure and improve response times." The officers closest to her nodded, impressed by the logic and clarity of her approach. Dalton, however, misinterpreted her suggestion as a challenge to his authority. "Captain," he snapped, pointing a finger, "I don't need your advice. I've run exercises like this for decades. Stick to your role and let me handle command." Alina's calm reply was measured and precise. "Understood, Colonel. I'll continue to support the mission in the best way possible." There was no defiance, only professionalism, but the subtlety of her intervention already improved the effectiveness of the exercise, a fact Dalton was too blind to notice. In the officers' quarters, whispers spread like wildfire. Soldiers speculated about Alina's past missions, her education, and her rapid rise through the ranks. "She's not just competent," a young lieutenant said, flipping through his notes from the day's briefings. "She's extraordinary. I've never seen someone handle pressure like that." Another officer nodded. "And she never loses her composure, even when Dalton is screaming at her." Even among enlisted personnel, respect for Alina quietly grew. She wasn't the type to boast, and she didn't need to dominate anyone to earn it. Her actions, consistent, calm, and effective, spoke louder than Dalton's theatrics ever could. Soldiers began seeking her advice on small matters, quietly observing how she managed tasks, and slowly learning the subtle art of leadership that was rooted in respect rather than fear. Dalton, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated. He could sense the quiet admiration for Alina, though he refused to acknowledge it openly. Each day, he tried harder to assert dominance, to mock her publicly, and to diminish her authority. Yet, each attempt backfired. Alina's efficiency, intelligence, and calm composure rendered his attacks meaningless in the eyes of the observers. By evening, Alina returned to her quarters, reviewing her notes and reflecting on the day. She had observed every flaw in Dalton's leadership, every inefficiency in the base, and every subtle sign of morale issues among the soldiers. Each detail, each pattern, each failure would be catalogued for the evaluation. Dalton's arrogance, it seemed, had provided her with the perfect cover. He believed he controlled everything, yet he had unknowingly revealed all his weaknesses. Outside, the sky was painted with shades of orange and purple. The base, quiet for the first time in hours, seemed almost serene, but Alina knew it was a storm waiting to break. Dalton remained oblivious, proud of the order he thought he maintained, blind to the fact that his authority was being quietly dismantled by someone far more capable. In the privacy of her quarters, Alina allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Fort Ridge was already learning slowly, quietly, and without knowing it, that appearances could be deceiving. She had arrived as a captain, underestimated by a colonel, but she already held the true measure of authority in her hands: preparation, intelligence, and the ability to act when the time was right. Tomorrow, she would continue to observe, continue to catalog, and continue to let Dalton's arrogance make the mistakes that would inevitably lead to his undoing. And when the moment came to reveal her true rank, the shock would be complete, not only for Dalton but for everyone who had underestimated her. Alina's mission was just beginning. Dalton, for all his bluster and confidence, had no idea that his empire of ego and intimidation was quietly being dismantled. By the time he realized it, it would be too late. The sun rose over Fort Ridge with a pale orange glow, illuminating the sprawling base in a way that made even its mundane structures look imposing. Captain Alina Ward walked briskly along the gravel pathways, her notebook in hand, eyes scanning the surroundings. Today marked the unofficial beginning of her mission. The day the Pentagon inspectors were set to arrive, and the day Colonel Bryce Dalton's carefully constructed facade would start to crumble. Dalton, as usual, arrived at the office early, already tense. He prided himself on appearances and control, and the presence of high-ranking evaluators made him even more anxious to assert his dominance. "Make sure everything is perfect," he barked to the staff, packing in his office like a caged predator. "We can't afford to look incompetent in front of them. And Captain Ward," he added, eyes narrowing, "I expect you to handle the minor details flawlessly. I don't want any mistakes." Alina nodded calmly, her expression neutral. In her mind, every word Dalton spoke was another window into his ego, another clue about the patterns of his leadership. He believed he was testing her, challenging her, asserting superiority, but in reality, he was revealing his own weaknesses to her careful scrutiny. By mid-morning, the Pentagon team arrived, a small group of officers tasked with observing and evaluating Fort Ridge's operations. Dalton greeted them with exaggerated charm, puffing out his chest, while Alina stayed quietly in the background, reviewing schedules, reports, and operational procedures. Dalton's performance, as usual, was theatrical. He interrupted subordinates, micromanaged logistics, and praised minor accomplishments with overblown enthusiasm, desperate to impress the visitors. Alina observed everything with quiet precision. She noted Dalton's over-reliance on appearances, his tendency to overreact under pressure, and the subtle inefficiencies caused by his need to dominate every situation. She also noted morale levels among the staff, low, tense, and fearful, all consequences of Dalton's leadership style. Every observation was carefully documented, forming a meticulous record that would later serve as evidence of systemic issues at Fort Ridge. Dalton, oblivious to the scrutiny directed at him, continued to assign Alina tasks he assumed were beneath her. "I need you to organize the vehicle logs, Captain," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Make sure everything is accurate. We can't have any mistakes in front of these inspectors." Alina accepted the task without comment. She moved through the paperwork efficiently, reorganizing records, correcting discrepancies, and creating a streamlined system that made the base operations more transparent and manageable. Officers around her exchanged glances of admiration, quietly noting how her calm presence seemed to improve workflow without overtly challenging Dalton. Meanwhile, Dalton's panic began to rise. The inspectors asked questions he couldn't answer without revealing the base's shortcomings. He tried to deflect blame onto subordinates, misrepresent data, and overstate accomplishments, but Alina's subtle interventions often corrected errors before they became obvious to the inspection team. Every time she did so, Dalton interpreted it as a minor nuisance rather than recognizing her true capability. In one particularly tense moment, the inspectors requested a demonstration of Fort Ridge's rapid response protocol. Dalton, eager to impress, insisted on directing every detail himself, shouting commands, interrupting his subordinates, and micromanaging the exercise. Alina stepped in quietly, suggesting minor adjustments framed as questions rather than directives. "Colonel, might it be more effective to position the reserve squad here? It could improve response time while maintaining security." Dalton bristled. "Captain Ward, this isn't a suggestion forum. I'm in charge, just follow instructions." Alina's reply was calm, professional, and unwavering. "Understood, Colonel. I'll ensure the team executes as directed while maintaining efficiency." The result was telling. With her subtle guidance, the exercise ran smoothly, showing the inspectors a level of organization Dalton alone could not have achieved. Observers noted the contrast between the colonel's chaos and Alina's composed competence. Whispers began to circulate among the inspectors themselves, noting the effectiveness of Alina's approach. though she remained in the background, allowing Dalton to believe he still controlled the narrative. Throughout the day, Dalton grew increasingly frustrated. His public bluster was failing. Minor mishaps, small oversights, and the subtle improvements Alina implemented highlighted his lack of foresight. Staff members whispered quietly, soldiers exchanged glances, and even the inspectors began to notice inconsistencies in Dalton's command. He interpreted these observations as challenges from the staff, not as reflections of his own failures, deepening his frustration and blinding him to the truth. By late afternoon, morale at Fort Ridge had noticeably shifted. Officers and enlisted personnel, previously intimidated by Dalton's arrogance, began to quietly acknowledge Alina's competence. Soldiers found themselves instinctively following her subtle instructions rather than Dalton's commands, and the overall efficiency of operations improved under her calm guidance. Yet Dalton remained oblivious, convinced that he was still the linchpin of authority. Alina's approach was deliberate. She never undermined Dalton publicly, never revealed her true role, and never allowed herself to be provoked. Instead, she acted with a steady hand, letting Dalton's mistakes accumulate while quietly guiding the base toward order and efficiency. Each error he made, each overreaction, each display of arrogance was carefully documented. By observing without interfering overtly, she ensured that the eventual revelation of her authority would be both dramatic and undeniable. That evening, as the inspection team prepared to leave, Dalton attempted one last display of dominance. He called a meeting, packing the floor and gesturing wildly, recounting the day's successes while glossing over failures. "We've handled everything perfectly," he declared. "Fort Ridge is the model of efficiency. I've maintained control as always." Alina allowed him to finish without interruption. When he finally paused for breath, she spoke softly but clearly. "Colonel, the base performed well under your leadership today, but there were several areas where minor adjustments improved operational efficiency. I've documented them for review, and the inspectors have noted the improvements in morale and workflow." Dalton's eyes flickered, sensing a subtle challenge but failing to grasp the full weight of her words. The staff exchanged glances, nodding her calm authority, and Dalton misread their reactions as deference rather than respect for Alina. As night fell over Fort Ridge, Alina returned to her quarters. The day had been a success. She had observed the base's strengths and weaknesses, cataloged every mistake made by Dalton, and subtly improved operations without revealing her true authority. Her mission was unfolding perfectly, and Dalton remained blissfully unaware that his every blustered command had strengthened her case for evaluation. Outside, the base was quiet except for the distant hum of generators and the soft murmur of soldiers concluding their daily routines. Alina stood by the window, notebook in hand, reviewing her observations. Dalton's arrogance, she noted, was predictable. His overconfidence and need for dominance created flaws that were easily documented, flaws that no inspection could ignore once her true authority was revealed. Alina smiled faintly. Fort Ridge, she realized, was about to learn a lesson in humility. Dalton, for all his ego and bravado, had no idea that the captain he mocked so freely was meticulously cataloging his failures, preparing for the moment when appearances would be shattered and true authority would be revealed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of leadership, and new opportunities for Dalton's arrogance to be exposed. And when that day came, Alina knew the entire base would witness what happens when true competence meets unchecked ego, a lesson that would leave a lasting mark on Fort Ridge forever. The following morning, Fort Ridge felt heavier, charged with an almost imperceptible tension. Captain Alina Ward moved through the base with her usual calm precision, but she could sense that Colonel Dalton's mood was deteriorating. The events of the past few days, subtle corrections, improved efficiency, and quiet competence had chipped away at his self-assured ego. The staff sensed it too. Whispers filled hallways and mess halls, officers exchanging nervous glances whenever Dalton barked orders. Dalton, oblivious to the admiration Alina commanded, began to unravel. He arrived at the morning briefing with his usual pomp, but his gestures were sharper, his voice louder, and his impatience evident. He shouted over subordinates, corrected minor mistakes with exaggerated frustration, and belittled anyone who even glanced toward Alina for guidance. "Captain Ward," he barked, slamming his hand on the table, "explain this discrepancy in the logistics report. How did this happen under your supervision?" Alina looked up, maintaining perfect composure. "Colonel, I've reviewed the discrepancies. They resulted from outdated procedures in the supply chain, not oversight on my part. I've implemented corrections to prevent recurrence." Her voice was calm, professional, and unwavering. Dalton's face flushed with irritation. He was unused to being contradicted, particularly in a manner that could not be dismissed as insolence. The officer's presence shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unwilling to intervene. Dalton, however, interpreted Alina's calm clarity as a personal challenge, which only fueled his mounting frustration. The day's operations intensified the strain. Dalton attempted to supervise a base-wide tactical drill personally, micromanaging every movement and issuing contradictory orders to teams across the training grounds. Alina, observing silently, noted the chaos that ensued. Soldiers hesitated, unsure which instructions to follow, and minor mistakes began to accumulate. Exactly the kind of predictable errors Dalton's lack of foresight would inevitably create. When a minor security breach occurred during the exercise, a simulated intrusion that revealed gaps in Dalton's procedural planning, he immediately blamed Alina, his anger flaring publicly. "Captain Ward," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger, "this is your responsibility. How could you allow such incompetence?" Alina remained calm, her gaze steady. "Colonel, the breach occurred due to systemic issues in the current protocol, not due to any individual oversight. I've documented the incident and proposed adjustments to prevent recurrence." Her explanation, measured and precise, only heightened Dalton's agitation. His attempts at humiliation had backfired. Instead of faltering, Alina's professionalism and intelligence made the flaws in his leadership glaringly apparent to everyone present. Soldiers exchanged subtle glances, noticing the contrast between Dalton's erratic behavior and Alina's composed authority. By mid-afternoon, Dalton's breaking point became unavoidable. He attempted to oversee a logistical coordination exercise, directing multiple teams of soldiers across the base simultaneously. His instructions were conflicting and chaotic, and morale visibly dropped. Officers whispered among themselves, realizing that the base's operations were functioning more effectively under Alina's quiet guidance than under Dalton's loud, domineering command. Alina, never one to escalate confrontation unnecessarily, intervened subtly. She restructured the workflow, assigning tasks in a manner that improved efficiency without overtly contradicting Dalton. The result was immediate. Operations stabilized, errors were corrected, and the base functioned more smoothly. Soldiers noticed the shift, instinctively following her guidance while Dalton fumed in the background, unaware of the full extent of her influence. By late afternoon, Dalton could no longer contain his frustration. He called an emergency staff meeting, packing the floor like a storm about to break. "I don't understand why nothing seems to be going right," he shouted. "We follow protocol, and yet errors keep happening. Captain Ward, explain yourself." Alina rose, calm and composed. "Colonel, the errors stem from outdated procedures and unclear communication channels. I've implemented corrections that have already improved efficiency and morale." Dalton's face turned red, veins bulging, as he realized that his authority was being undermined not by disrespect, but by competence. The officers present could barely conceal their reactions. For the first time, many openly questioned his leadership, though no one dared speak against him directly. As the day drew to a close, the pattern was clear. Dalton's repeated efforts to assert dominance had only amplified the weaknesses he had long ignored. His leadership style, rooted in fear, intimidation, and overconfidence, had created vulnerabilities that Alina had quietly documented and corrected without overt confrontation. The junior officers and enlisted soldiers, inspired by Alina's composure and effectiveness, began to quietly rely on her guidance. Her subtle adjustments and calm demeanor restored order to the base, while Dalton's public outbursts continued to escalate. Each failure, each display of frustration, only reinforced the invisible record Alina was building evidence that would later demonstrate not just incompetence, but systemic leadership failure. By evening, Dalton's breakdown reached its peak. He stormed through the corridors, barking orders, chastising staff, and attempting to assert control over tasks already managed more efficiently by Alina. Soldiers ducked under his gaze, officers avoided eye contact, and the atmosphere of tension was palpable. Yet Alina remained composed, walking with measured steps, reviewing her notes and observing the unfolding chaos. She understood something the colonel did not. Leadership was not about bluster, intimidation, or theatrics. True authority relied on competence, clarity, and the respect earned through consistent action. Dalton, for all his ego and experience, had failed to understand this fundamental principle. That evening, as the base quieted, Alina returned to her quarters. She reviewed the day's events meticulously, cataloging Dalton's mistakes, the instances of chaos, and the subtle improvements she had implemented to maintain order. Every failure he had made under pressure, every moment of irrational behavior, every spike in frustration had been carefully recorded. Outside, the night was calm, yet the base itself seemed charged with anticipation. Soldiers whispered in mess halls and corridors, officers exchanged cautious glances, and Dalton remained unaware of the growing perception that his leadership was faltering. Alina, however, saw clearly. She had orchestrated a delicate balance, allowing Dalton's arrogance to expose itself while subtly guiding the base toward stability and efficiency. Her mind, calm and focused, plotted the next phase of her mission. The breaking point had arrived. Dalton's confidence had been shattered incrementally, his ego bruised by the evidence of his own mismanagement. When the time came to reveal her authority, the contrast between her competence and his arrogance would be undeniable. Alina allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had maintained professionalism, upheld morale, and subtly improved base operations, all while letting Dalton's mistakes accumulate. The stage was set. The storm of accountability would soon arrive, and Dalton's downfall, inevitable and complete, would serve as a lesson to everyone at Fort Ridge. For now, though, Alina rested briefly, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Pentagon inspection continued. The base's weaknesses were still being observed, and Dalton's arrogance would continue to create opportunities for exposure. Every action she took, every calm intervention, was part of a larger strategy that would culminate in a revelation that none of them, least of all Dalton, would ever forget. Fort Ridge, she realized, was a living lesson in leadership, one that Dalton had underestimated completely. And Alina Ward, quiet, composed, and far more powerful than he could imagine, was the one who would teach it. The morning sun rose over Fort Ridge, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Captain Alina Ward walked calmly through the base, notebook in hand, prepared for another day of observation. But today was different. Today, the final phase of her mission would unfold. The Pentagon's lead general was arriving to review the base's performance, and Dalton had no idea that the woman he had mocked repeatedly would soon reveal her true authority. Colonel Bryce Dalton entered the conference room early, his posture rigid, chest puffed with overconfidence. He had spent the last week preparing for this visit, rehearsing his speeches, polishing his reports, and reminding his staff that he was the ultimate authority at Fort Ridge. "This inspection will prove my leadership is flawless," he muttered to himself, eyes scanning the room like a general preening before an audience. Alina arrived quietly, taking her usual place near the back of the room. She carried herself with her typical calm authority, her presence understated yet commanding. Dalton glanced at her, smirked, and whispered under his breath, "Still acting like you belong, Captain. We'll see about that." He had no idea how accurate his assessment of her presence would turn out, though for him, in the worst possible way. As the Pentagon team settled in, Dalton launched into his presentation, detailing base operations, protocols, and successes. His voice was loud, confident, and rehearsed, but cracks were already showing. Officers around him exchanged subtle glances, noting inconsistencies in his reports, minor oversights he glossed over, and moments where his arrogance had clearly interfered with decision-making. The staff remained polite but tense, the air heavy with anticipation. Alina observed silently, taking careful mental notes. Every statement Dalton made, every overconfident gesture, and every attempt to control the narrative was being catalogued. She did not interrupt, did not correct him, allowing the contrast between his inflated self-perception and the reality of base operations to become apparent. Her patience had paid off. Dalton was exposing himself in ways that no evaluation could ignore. Finally, the lead general turned to Alina. "Captain Ward," he said, voice carrying across the room, "we'd like to hear your assessment of Fort Ridge operations." Dalton's smirk faltered, confused at the sudden attention directed at Alina rather than himself. Alina rose slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She addressed the room, but her eyes were on Dalton. "Sir, the base has strong potential, but there are systemic issues in leadership, protocol, and morale that need to be addressed. Minor corrections have already improved efficiency, and adjustments I've implemented today have stabilized operations that were previously vulnerable to errors." Her tone was polite, professional, but unmistakably authoritative. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The general leaned forward, intrigued. "Captain Ward," he said, "please identify yourself and your official capacity." Alina paused, a quiet smile forming. "Yes, sir. I am Major General Alina Ward, Lead Inspector for the National Military Leadership Review. My role here is to evaluate the base's command structure, personnel performance, and overall operational readiness." The room fell silent. Dalton's face turned pale as his mind scrambled to comprehend the words. "Wow, what?" he stammered, voice breaking. His arrogance, which had carried him for years, faltered completely in the face of a truth he had never imagined. The woman he had mocked, humiliated, and underestimated was not only above him in rank, she outranked him by miles. Officers and soldiers alike watched in stunned silence. Whispers turned into audible murmurs. Some of Dalton's staff who had suspected her importance now realized the truth. Alina's calm composure, her quiet authority, and her efficiency were no longer subtle hints. They were undeniable evidence of her true rank and mission. Alina continued, addressing both the general and the staff with professional precision. "Colonel Dalton's dedication to Fort Ridge is noted," she said carefully, "but the over-reliance on personal authority, lack of procedural oversight, and patterns of intimidation have negatively impacted efficiency, morale, and operational readiness. My recommendations will include leadership training, reassignment, and restructuring of certain procedures to ensure the base operates effectively under transparent and accountable command." Dalton tried to interrupt, his voice rising in panic. I don't understand. I've led this base for years. Alina's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Colonel, your contributions are acknowledged, but leadership is measured by effectiveness, consistency, and the respect of your subordinates, not by arrogance or theatrics. Today, the observations confirm that your command style has created vulnerabilities that require immediate correction." The weight of her words hit Dalton like a physical blow. Officers exchanged glances, soldiers murmured in quiet approval, and the general nodded, clearly impressed by her thorough assessment. The room was tense, but Alina's calm authority dominated. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult Dalton, yet every word cut through the facade of his ego. Dalton, pale and shaking, tried to regain control. But I thought I was maintaining order. The base functions perfectly under my command. Alina's response was gentle but firm. Colonel, the base functions because of the dedication of its personnel, not because of any single individual. Leadership requires guidance, support, and the ability to recognize one's own limitations. Today's observations confirm that systemic improvements are needed for sustained success. The general addressed the room, eyes fixed on Dalton. Colonel Dalton, this evaluation highlights serious deficiencies in leadership. While your commitment to the base is acknowledged, corrective action is necessary. Captain, or rather, Major General Ward, your findings will form the basis of these changes. The room erupted in subtle murmurs of astonishment. Dalton's face was red with humiliation. The colonel who had mocked Alina repeatedly now realized he had been the subject of meticulous observation by someone who not only outranked him, but had also maintained perfect composure under his relentless attempts at intimidation. Alina turned to Dalton one last time, her voice steady and calm. Colonel, I hope this experience provides insight into the importance of humility, accountability, and the true measure of leadership. The lessons learned here will benefit both you and Fort Ridge moving forward. Dalton swallowed hard, unable to speak. His decades of authority, built on ego and intimidation, had been dismantled in minutes by someone whose quiet competence had been underestimated from the very beginning. The staff and soldiers who had witnessed his mockery now watched him with pity, relief, and a newfound respect for Alina. After the debriefing concluded, Alina walked out of the conference room, her presence commanding silent respect. Officers followed her gaze, soldiers exchanged impressed glances, and Dalton lingered, frozen in disbelief. He had spent years believing in the supremacy of rank and bluster, only to discover that true authority required intelligence, preparation, and integrity. That evening, as the base settled into an unusual quiet, Alina reflected on the day. Her mission had been a success. Dalton had been exposed, the staff's morale had shifted in favor of competence over intimidation, and Fort Ridge had witnessed a rare lesson in leadership. Outside, the night sky shimmered over the base. Alina stood on her balcony, notebook in hand, recording the final observations of the day. She had revealed her true authority at precisely the right moment, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with professionalism, patience, and undeniable competence. Dalton had learned in the harshest way possible that mocking and underestimating someone based on appearances could have serious consequences. And for the first time, Fort Ridge understood that leadership was not about rank alone. It was about respect, skill, and the quiet power of someone who could act decisively when the time was right. Alina closed her notebook, satisfied. The base would never forget this day. And Dalton, humbled and exposed, would carry the lesson with him forever that true leadership is earned, not assumed. The morning after the revelation, Fort Ridge buzzed with a tense mix of curiosity, awe, and cautious optimism. Soldiers, officers, and staff who had previously tiptoed around Colonel Dalton now whispered quietly about the dramatic turn of events. Alina Ward, now fully recognized as Major General, moved calmly through the base, observing operations, reviewing reports, and quietly ensuring that her influence would lead to genuine improvements. Dalton, meanwhile, was a shadow of the man he had been. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by stiff movements and nervous glances. He wandered the corridors, trying to assert authority, but the weight of his public humiliation lingered like an invisible chain. Staff members avoided eye contact when possible, unsure whether to follow his instructions or Alina's subtle guidance. The dynamic of Fort Ridge had shifted irreversibly. In the early briefing, Alina gathered the senior officers. "We have an opportunity to restructure Fort Ridge into a model base for efficiency, morale, and accountability," she began. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and commanding, a sharp contrast to Dalton's previous bluster. This requires cooperation, transparency, and a commitment to consistent leadership. Colonel Dalton, your experience is valuable, but we must address the gaps in operational protocols and leadership methods that have been identified. Dalton's face reddened, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He wanted to argue, to assert that his decades of command should shield him from criticism, but he quickly realized that resistance would only further expose him. Alina's presence, calm and unyielding, made it clear that her authority was absolute. The senior officers, previously cautious around Dalton, now listened attentively. Alina outlined specific areas needing reform, procedural inconsistencies in supply chains, gaps in tactical protocols, and morale issues caused by a reliance on intimidation rather than guidance. She explained her plans for leadership workshops, mentorship programs, and improved communication channels across the base. Every recommendation was precise, actionable, and supported by data she had meticulously collected during her days of observation. Dalton attempted to interject, voice trembling slightly. I think these measures are unnecessary. The base has functioned well for years under my command. Morale is fine, efficiency is adequate. Alina turned toward him, eyes steady. Colonel, the metrics, observations, and feedback from personnel indicate otherwise. Leadership is not defined by tradition or appearances, but by effectiveness, adaptability, and the ability to inspire confidence. The current state of operations demonstrates areas that require immediate improvement. We are here to address them, not to assign blame. For the first time, Dalton was silent. He had spent decades relying on fear, ego, and appearances to maintain control. Now, those very tools had proven ineffective against someone whose authority was rooted in competence, preparation, and respect. The officers present, who had long endured Dalton's bullying, quietly felt a weight lift from their shoulders. Alina's calm professionalism was restoring confidence in leadership at Fort Ridge. Throughout the day, Alina began implementing the reforms she had outlined. She started with supply chain management, reviewing inventory logs, correcting discrepancies, and introducing a clear, transparent reporting system. Officers who had previously struggled under Dalton's erratic management began to adapt quickly, appreciating the clarity and efficiency her approach provided. Soldiers noticed subtle changes. Instructions were clear, communication was concise, and morale improved as confidence in leadership grew. Dalton shadowed her every step, initially attempting to assert control. "This isn't the way we've always done it," he protested, his voice loud but lacking conviction. Alina listened patiently, then addressed him gently but firmly. "Colonel, tradition has its place, but it cannot replace efficiency, safety, and morale. The adjustments we are implementing are designed to strengthen the base, not diminish your contributions." The subtle balance of correction and respect was key. Alina allowed Dalton to maintain dignity while slowly teaching him that leadership required adaptability, humility, and accountability. Officers and soldiers began to follow instructions more efficiently, no longer fearful of punishment, but motivated by clear expectations and structured guidance. By afternoon, the base was already functioning more smoothly than it had under Dalton's sole direction. Alina led a tactical exercise, overseeing logistics, communication, and troop movements. The operation was seamless, soldiers executed orders precisely, efficiency was high, and morale was visible in their focused movements. Dalton watched from the sidelines, realizing he could no longer command the base through fear or ego alone. His attempts at control now seemed both futile and embarrassing. After the exercise, Alina conducted a leadership workshop for senior officers. She emphasized accountability, communication, and respect as pillars of effective command. "Authority is not given, it is earned," she explained. "It is demonstrated through competence, integrity, and the ability to guide others without intimidation. Every leader here has the responsibility to uphold these principles." Dalton sat quietly, absorbing the words, though pride and confusion warred within him. For the first time in years, he realized that his style of command, authoritarian, fear-based, ego-driven, had done more harm than good. Alina's calm, professional guidance had illuminated his shortcomings not through humiliation, but through demonstration of superior leadership. Throughout the day, officers began to adopt Alina's methods. Clear reporting structures, efficient workflows, and transparent communication became the new standard. Soldiers followed orders with confidence rather than fear, morale improved visibly, and even minor errors were corrected swiftly without punitive measures. Fort Ridge, once a place of tension and intimidation, was beginning to function as a cohesive, motivated unit. Dalton, though humbled, began to see the value in Alina's approach. He observed quietly, occasionally attempting to offer suggestions, but for the first time he listened instead of dictating. The base had shifted under her guidance, and he was forced to accept that leadership required more than rank or bluster. It required understanding, adaptability, and respect. By evening, Alina returned to her quarters, satisfied with the day's progress. She reviewed the improvements, the adoption of new procedures, and the visible increase in morale. The base was transforming before her eyes, and Dalton, once a figure of intimidation, had become a cautious observer, learning the value of humility and competence. Outside, the night air was cool and still. Alina gazed over Fort Ridge, notebook in hand, reflecting on the transformation she had initiated. The base had witnessed the true meaning of leadership, authority rooted in respect, competence, and careful guidance, not fear or ego. Dalton had learned, albeit slowly and painfully, that appearances and rank alone were insufficient. As soldiers retired to their quarters, officers continued reviewing new procedures, and Dalton lingered in the background. Alina understood that the work was far from over. Change, she knew, was gradual, requiring patience, reinforcement, and consistent leadership. But the foundation had been laid. Fort Ridge was on a new path, one of efficiency, accountability, and respect, a legacy that would outlast any single officer's ego. Alina closed her notebook, allowing herself a rare, satisfied smile. She had turned a base ruled by fear and arrogance into a functioning, motivated unit. Dalton had been humbled, the staff had learned to follow guidance instead of intimidation, and the soldiers now respected leadership grounded in competence. The lessons of the past week would resonate for years, a testament to the power of patience, preparation, and true authority. Tomorrow would bring further refinement, additional training, and continued reinforcement of the new culture at Fort Ridge. Alina knew that sustained change required vigilance, but the first critical steps had been completed. The colonel who had mocked her repeatedly was no longer untouchable. He had been replaced in influence, if not rank, by someone whose quiet competence had proven far more powerful than arrogance or theatrics ever could. The morning air at Fort Ridge carried a sense of renewal. Soldiers and officers moved with purpose, executing routines with confidence and precision. Alina Ward, now fully recognized as Major General, walked through the base with her usual composed demeanor. Every step she took was a silent assertion of authority, calm, measured, and respected by everyone around her. The transformation that had begun with her revelation was now fully underway. Colonel Dalton, once the unchallenged master of Fort Ridge, followed the new protocols obediently. He had been humbled but had also begun to understand the value of the lessons Alina had imparted. Leadership, he realized, was not about intimidation or rank alone. True authority was earned through competence, respect, and the ability to inspire confidence in those under one's command. His previous arrogance had alienated his staff. Alina's guidance was now teaching him how to lead effectively. The base's operations were seamless. Supply lines ran efficiently, communication channels were clear, and morale had reached levels Dalton had never thought possible. Soldiers moved with confidence, knowing that their actions were guided by clear expectations and structured leadership. Officers collaborated rather than competed, understanding that efficiency and mutual respect were essential to operational success. Fort Ridge had become more than just a military base. It was a model of effective leadership and teamwork. Alina began the day with a briefing for all officers, emphasizing accountability and continuous improvement. Leadership is a living process, she explained, voice calm but firm. It requires constant attention, evaluation, and adaptation. The base is stronger because every individual is empowered to act responsibly, not out of fear, but because they understand their role and the value of their actions. The officers listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Dalton, standing quietly at the back of the room, absorbed the words with humility. He had spent years believing authority was synonymous with fear, yet now he understood that respect and competence were far more effective tools. Alina's influence had reshaped not only the structure of Fort Ridge but the very mindset of its leadership. As the day progressed, Alina oversaw a series of tactical exercises designed to reinforce the new protocols and ensure everyone understood their roles. She moved among the soldiers and officers, offering guidance where necessary, but always in a calm, unobtrusive manner. Dalton shadowed her, occasionally offering suggestions, but he no longer attempted to dominate or undermine. For the first time, he was learning, quietly, patiently, from someone he had once dismissed as beneath him. The impact of her leadership was evident in the results. Exercises ran smoothly, errors were minimal, and soldiers executed complex maneuvers with confidence. Officers reported that coordination and communication had never been stronger. Alina's presence, calm yet commanding, had instilled a sense of purpose and cohesion that had previously been lacking. By mid-afternoon, Alina gathered the senior officers for a strategy session. She reviewed operational protocols, identified areas for continued improvement, and encouraged open dialogue. "We must remain vigilant," she said. "Efficiency, morale, and accountability are ongoing responsibilities. Leadership is not static. It evolves with every challenge, every decision, and every interaction." Dalton, seated quietly, listened and reflected. He realized that his previous approach, rigid, authoritarian, and ego-driven, had limited the potential of the base. Alina's methods had not only corrected inefficiencies but had also empowered the personnel, creating an environment where initiative and responsibility were encouraged. The contrast was stark, and Dalton could not deny the results. The soldiers, once intimidated by Dalton's bluster, now moved with confidence. They knew that mistakes would be addressed constructively, that their contributions mattered, and that leadership was based on guidance rather than fear. The atmosphere was one of mutual respect, collaboration, and shared purpose, a testament to Alina's skill as a leader. That evening, Alina convened a final meeting to solidify the reforms and ensure the base's long-term success. "Fort Ridge has demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability," she said, addressing both officers and soldiers. "Our success is not due to one individual, but to the collective effort, clarity of purpose, and adherence to principles of effective leadership. The lessons learned here will serve as a foundation for continued excellence." Dalton, now visibly changed, spoke up. "Major General Ward," he said, voice steady, "I see now how my previous methods fell short. I am grateful for the guidance and for the example you have set. I will do my best to uphold these principles and support the base under your leadership." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with quiet acknowledgement and approval. Dalton's public humility marked a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire base. The once intimidating colonel was now a committed participant in a leadership model built on respect, efficiency, and accountability. As night fell over Fort Ridge, Alina stood on the balcony of her quarters, notebook in hand. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the initial mockery, the subtle observations, the patient documentation, and the eventual revelation of her authority. Dalton's downfall had not been personal vengeance. It had been a demonstration of the principles she valued: competence, preparation, and ethical leadership. The base, now operating smoothly under her guidance, symbolized the power of respect and integrity in leadership. Soldiers and officers alike had learned that authority earned through competence and fairness was far more effective than authority imposed through fear. Dalton's transformation, once unimaginable, served as a lasting reminder of the lessons she had imparted. In the following days, Alina continued to refine operations, mentor officers, and ensure that the new culture of leadership was deeply ingrained. Dalton, having accepted his role under her guidance, became a willing participant in the reforms, learning to lead with humility and integrity. The base continued to thrive, and morale reached unprecedented levels. Fort Ridge had undergone a complete transformation. The mockery and chaos of the past week were replaced by professionalism, efficiency, and respect. Alina's quiet yet decisive actions had reshaped the entire culture, leaving a legacy that would endure long after she moved on. Soldiers now looked to her not with fear, but with admiration and confidence. Officers learned that leadership was earned, not assumed. Alina's final observation for the day was simple but profound. Leadership was not about who shouted the loudest, who commanded the most respect on paper, or who clung to ego. It was about preparation, competence, humility, and the ability to inspire confidence in others. Fort Ridge was living proof that when these principles were applied, even the most rigid and hierarchical systems could transform into models of excellence. As the base settled into quiet night, Alina closed her notebook, satisfied. The mission was complete. She had turned a base ruled by fear and arrogance into a center of respect, efficiency, and accountability. Dalton had been humbled, the staff empowered, and the soldiers inspired. Fort Ridge was no longer just a military installation. It was a testament to the power of true leadership. Looking out over the training grounds, she allowed herself a rare smile. The lessons learned, the challenges overcome, and the transformations achieved would leave a lasting imprint. Alina Ward, underestimated and mocked, had proven that true authority lies not in rank alone, but in competence, patience, and the unwavering pursuit of excellence. And as Fort Ridge slept under the quiet stars, one truth remained clear. Leadership, when wielded with skill, integrity, and respect, could change everything.